we spoke about right at the start of this session was the idea of exercise domains and phase-based responses. And this is really important. Now, this connects what we've been learning about in terms of VO2 kinetic responses with what we've learned in previous sessions. If you haven't been through these sessions, please do, in relation to gas exchange thresholds, maximal lactate steady states, and respiratory compensation points. And we're going to use this schematic here from Dave Paul and Andy Jones again. And this is really important for us. Why? Because what it sets out for us is 3 exercise domains. And what this shows us is the VO2 kinetic response. So this is breath by breath data. And notice they've identified for us 3 zones. And we have 3 demarcations. We have the moderate intensity zone, which is where we can achieve a very normal steady state response. We have a deficit, so there's still obviously an increase in ATP turnover rate, but the amount of ATP that's required at the tissue is actually proportionally quite low, certainly compared to these other intensities up here, and we reach a steady state. And notice you reach steady state in around about 2 minutes, irrespective of whether I'm at a low moderate intensity or a high moderate intensity. The demarcation, the boundary between what we call moderate and heavy is the gas exchange threshold. The transition from predominantly aerobic to predominantly non-aerobic or anaerobic based metabolism. It also reflects that boundary where, look what happens. As we go get that transition, the deficit increases quite significantly. Remember, we've already suggested as exercise intensity gets higher, you have to borrow more energy at the onset of exercise, so you're going to have a greater deficit. But now what I want you to do is look for where you see steady state occurring. Now you may want to pause the video to have a think where this happens. So where is steady state? Well, actually steady state, when we start to look at this, is probably in the region of only starting to occur at maybe 240 seconds. Look, you see that it starts to rise. Sorry, not 240 seconds. I want you to look at what happens at 240 seconds, apologies. You can see that it starts to level out at about 240 seconds, and it's quite difficult to see in this schematic, but I'll show you in more detail in a moment. But it does just rise a little bit. If you take the average response, it rises a bit. And that's important. We'll come back to why that's important in a moment. But then we have this third domain referred to as severe. The upper boundary is VO2 max, the ceiling for cardiorespiratory physiology. But the boundary between heavy and severe is demarcated by what is called critical power, which we'll cover in another session. But critical power is the same as what we have previously learned as respiratory compensation point or maximal lactate steady state. In other words, it represents the boundary between steady state and non-steady state exercise. Look what happens. They cannot sustain a steady state. So the VO2 rises to the point of volitional exhaustion. So when you go beyond critical power, MLSS or RCP, but below VO2 max, then the VO2 will always rise to VO2 max. You do not get a steady state response. These two here are great examples of when the exercise is extreme. That is performed probably at an intensity beyond VO2 max. Therefore, they stop for an alternate reason. They don't stop because of a volitional exhaustion. So the kinetics of VO2 enable us to understand there are 3 distinct exercise domains. And as I've got here, this is also the boundary. These are the same things. They demarcate the same thing: respiratory compensation point or maximal lactate steady state. And so these schematics, this is from a quite nice paper from Dave Paul and Andy Jones. And what you've got here, here's we've got our time. Here we've got our baseline, moderate. So you can follow the deficit, fairly small deficit, get a steady state. But in heavy, as we reported, the VO2 looks like it's about to level out at about 2 to 3 minutes. But then you get this acceleration in the VO2 response. So there's clearly a difference between what should be happening, which is here, and what actually happens here. And we'll come back to what that is in a moment. And then in the severe domain, notice that the VO2 never reaches steady state. It keeps climbing and the deficit keeps getting bigger and bigger until we hit the point of volitional exhaustion, that is VO2 max. So not only are there differences in the responses at the onset of exercise in terms of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, But there are also differences and understandings we need to make in terms of the kinetics of VO2 between our three exercise domains. And this is data taken, published from our laboratory back in 2009. And this is where we asked people to blood donate. We took half a litre of blood out of our participants. But what I want you to do is I want you to focus on, it doesn't matter whether you're really looking at trial 1 or 2 against 3 and 4, but just focus on, say, trial 1 and focus on trial 3 as a comparison. So if you look at trial 1, here's the phase 1 response. This is the cardiodynamic. The VO2 rises. This is phase 2. And it pretty much levels out. We've got this kind of very nice leveling out based response that you see here. But now, here's the cardiodynamic phase 1. VO2 rises. Looks like it's leveling out and then accelerates again and eventually reaches steady state over here. This is referred to as the VO2 slow component. That is the VO2 response that is superimposed on top of the anticipated VO2 response for that workload. Remember that we've been learning previously that VO2 responds linearly to exercise intensity. So theoretically we can predict what the VO2 response would be to exercise intensity. The truth is actually slightly different. That after about 3 minutes, yeah, you look like you're getting a steady state response and it would be linearly proportional to the exercise intensity. But actually VO2 then suddenly rises again. And so if we slide back, this area here, which is the difference between the oxygen that was consumed and the oxygen that theoretically should have been consumed had a steady state been achieved, is what's referred to as the VO2 slow component. In the severe domain, the same thing happens. Remember, if we're working above maximal lactate steady state, or however you want to define it as critical power or RCP, we can predict what the VO2 response should have been, but it never attains steady state and it keeps rising to that point of volitional exhaustion, the VO2 max. And here's data again from our laboratory, and you can just see the same thing. So here we've got a single participant in the moderate domain, which is over here, and what we've had them do is exercise at delta 50%, so there's 50% of the difference between rest and the gas exchange threshold. So here we've got them at rest, we apply the external load, there's an immediate increase in the ATP turnover rate until we reach steady state. So in other words, the VO2 goes through a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 response, we get a steady state. But now look at what happens when we put them in the moderate domain. So the moderate domain, we've gone for delta 20% of gas exchange threshold to VO2 max. Now, I'll show you there's perhaps a more efficient way of doing this. The reason we couldn't do it the efficient way was we didn't at the time have access to, for example, maximal lactate steady state data or critical power. So we went for something which was close to gas exchange threshold, which puts us, if it's above that, it puts us in the heavy domain, but not so far into the heavy domain that we're worryingly into the severe domain. Same thing happens. You get the immediate increase in the ATP turnover rate, so VO2 rises, but we're borrowing anaerobic energy at the onset of exercise, and it looks like we're leveling out, and then suddenly VO2 kicks again, and so this little area under here, it's not very obvious, represents the VO2 slow component. That is an additional oxygen cost on top of what we predicted we would have used. And this is kind of nice. So here you've got the VO2 response and the PCR responses to moderate, which is kind of our open circles, and then heavy, which is our closed circles, exercise. I don't want you to worry about the off-transit responses. I just want you to worry about the on-transit and the exercise response. So you can see that you've got a moderate domain here, they reach a steady state. If in the heavy domain, can you see it's rising, rising, and then it just gently kicks. It loses the steady state condition. So the difference between the oxygen that would have been consumed, which is probably around about here, where my marker is, and what was actually consumed is the VO2 slow component. But notice that the deficit is actually fairly similar up to that roughly 3 minute, 2 minute time period, probably 2 minute time period. So therefore the amount of PCR that they've borrowed is fairly similar. So it kind of tells us that this moderate and heavy domain exercise were probably just above and just below our gas exchange threshold.